In a courtroom packed with reporters and royal watchers, a single name stopped time. Camilla. Princess Diana's sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, took the stand and calmly dismantled decades of royal narrative. Her words confirmed what many feared: the affair never stopped. Watching remotely, King Charles visibly recoiled, muttering under his breath before cutting his video feed. A storm had broken not just in court, but across Britain. Letters, dates, perfume-soaked memories, truths long buried now aired in daylight. This wasn't just scandal, it was royal reconstruction by truth. And the world was finally hearing Diana's story. In her own words, the court case that opened the floodgates, it started quietly, just another line item buried in the morning court reports. A private collector who had legally acquired several of Princess Diana's handwritten letters filed a case requesting the right to publish them. But what began as a niche legal battle over archival material quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive royal trials in modern history. By June 2026, the case reached the High Court, and whispers began circling. These weren't just ordinary letters, they were detailed emotional records from Diana herself, containing names, dates, and recollections that didn't align with the palace's public narrative. At first, the palace treated the matter with calm detachment. Spokespeople issued vague statements calling it a private legal issue, hoping the noise would die down. Things took a serious turn when several former royal aides, some of whom had served Diana personally, were subpoenaed to testify. This signaled something deeper was brewing. This wasn't about publishing rights anymore. It was about truth. What was inside those letters, and why were key figures from the past being called into the open? The turning point came when Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Diana's eldest sister, unexpectedly agreed to take the stand. Her name hadn't appeared in the early legal filings, and many assumed she would stay silent out of loyalty, but she volunteered, asking to testify under oath about events that had taken place between 1985 and 1997, the span of Diana's marriage, separation, and final years. What happened next would change everything. Palace insiders, especially those close to King Charles, believed Lady Sarah would provide a soft, protective account, perhaps clarifying a few misunderstandings. But when she entered the courtroom, her presence was calm, clear, and devastatingly precise. Her testimony, described later as surgical, cut through decades of half-truths and royal public relations. One former aide later said, "We thought she'd shield the institution. Instead, she lit the match." The floodgates were no longer creaking, they were open as journalists scrambled to refrain their headlines, and the palace issued a tense "no comment." All eyes turned to what Lady Sarah had to say next. The courtroom was packed. The following morning, reporters, legal observers, and even a few off-duty royals sat in shadowed corners. If the trial was the storm, then Sarah's testimony would be the lightning strike, calm on the outside, but carrying the voltage to burn through years of royal myth-making. What she revealed next would silence the entire room. Lady Sarah's calm. When Lady Sarah McCorquodale took the stand, the room held its breath. Her voice was steady, neither emotional nor theatrical, but each sentence she spoke carried weight. She began by saying that Diana had confided in her regularly, especially during the darker years of her marriage. "She told me everything," Sarah said, "especially when she felt unheard by others." Then came the revelation that shook the room. Diana had spoken to her about Camilla, his involvement in the marriage, well before the divorce, not after, as the palace had always claimed. Sarah didn't just rely on memory, she brought specifics. She referenced letters, diary entries, and handwritten notes she'd seen over the years. One note, dated spring 1986, directly mentioned Camilla. In it, Diana wrote, "It's like living with a ghost between us. She's always here, just out of reach." Sarah explained that Diana believed the relationship between Charles and Camilla had never truly ended. It had simply gone underground once Diana became his wife. This wasn't a rekindling, Sarah said plainly. It never ended. The courtroom, packed with media and royal watchers, went dead silent. Even seasoned reporters were stunned. For decades, the palace had framed Charles and Camilla love story as one of tragic timing, a romance caused by duty and resumed only after Diana and Charles had parted ways. But Sarah's testimony shattered that narrative. It wasn't a story of missed chances, it was a story of ongoing betrayal. That distinction changed everything. One quote from Sarah made headlines within minutes. This wasn't about a marriage that failed on its own, it was pushed. The emotional core of her testimony wasn't just about Camilla, it was about Diana's isolation. Her sense that no one believed her even when she gave them the truth. Sarah's calm delivery made it all the more impactful. As one legal analyst noted, she didn't shout, she didn't accuse, she just spoke. And that's why the world listened. The public was still digesting Sarah's words when cameras in the courtroom flickered toward a remote video screen. King Charles was appearing via live feed due to health reasons. Until now he had remained composed, speaking only when necessary. But when Sarah referenced the 1986 letter, everything changed. What followed was one of the most surreal moments in modern royal history. A real-time unraveling of composure captured on camera and broadcast to millions. The next shock wasn't from testimony. It came from the king himself. King Charles's public reaction in real time. As Lady Sarah spoke, all eyes weren't just on her, they were also on the small screen displaying a live feed from King Charles, who appeared from a private room at Clarence House. He had chosen not to attend in person due to reported health concerns, but legal protocols required him to be present remotely. Until that moment he'd remained still, composed and largely silent. But the moment Sarah mentioned the 1986 handwritten notes, the camera caught a visible shift. His mouth moved, his brow tightened, and then clearly caught on video, he muttered something under his breath. She promised she'd never. Within seconds the screen went black. A court clerk confirmed that the king's video had been deliberately turned off. Nearly 20 minutes passed before it reappeared. In that time a palace lawyer urgently requested a recess, citing that the king was emotionally overwhelmed by the mischaracterization of personal events. But the damage was already done. The press pool picked up on the phrase he had spoken, and within hours lip readers confirmed it. The quote echoed through social media. She promised she'd never. The question burned: who was she, and what promise had been broken? Observers noted the rare vulnerability. Charles had long been trained in the art of stoic public performance. But this was unfiltered, raw, and deeply personal. For decades he had relied on public relations to help reshape the story of his life. Now, in a matter of seconds, that carefully rebuilt image cracked in front of a live audience. One commentator described it as the moment the myth of control died. The king didn't speak again during that day's proceedings, but his silence was as loud as any testimony. Palisades scrambled behind the scenes, trying to downplay what had just occurred. They issued a brief statement calling the king's reaction understandable in light of deeply personal family matters. But analysts weren't convinced this wasn't just emotion. One expert said it was recognition. He knew what Sarah was saying wasn't speculation. It was memory, and it was true. For the public it wasn't just shocking, it was confirming. As the king's screen faded back to grey, the courtroom returned its focus to the evidence. But there was a different energy now. Or wait, the next set of documents introduced by the legal team would take the case into even more intimate territory. Letters with perfume-stained paper, sarcastic notes from Camilla and Diana's heartbreak, captured in ink for years. The timeline of Camilla, his involvement, had been debated, but what came next would erase all doubt. Lady Sarah had opened the door. Now the full affair would walk into the light. Camilla affair timeline finally exposed. The next wave of revelations hit harder than expected. Court officials introduced a set of handwritten letters and notes from 1985 to 19. He goes, presented by Lady Sarah herself. Among them was a particularly devastating letter from Diana to her sister dated December 1986, where she wrote, "They think I don't know what I hear, her perfume and his hair." That line echoed through the courtroom, painting a vivid picture of how deeply Diana sensed Camilla, his presence not as a rumor, but as a daily intimate intrusion in her marriage. Sarah detailed how Diana had long suspected the affair was ongoing. She told the court that Diana often mentioned secret lunches, coded notes, and untraceable phone calls. According to her, the affair didn't resume after Diana's separation. It never stopped. One note from Diana read, "He smiles when he thinks no one's watching. That smile is for her, not me." Another included Camilla's sarcastic message, "Thank you for keeping him busy." The courtroom bristled. These were not vague anecdotes, they were timestamps of deceit scribbled in real time. The most damning element wasn't just the content, it was the pattern. Lady Sarah presented over a dozen documents, many of which had never been seen publicly. They all referenced key events, dates, and emotional breakdowns that aligned with known royal appearances and trips. On one occasion, Diana described catching a whiff of Camilla perfume on Charles the evening after a public gala. Zara testified that she remembered Diana crying in the bathroom, torn between public duty and private despair. It was the kind of detail that no palace briefing could explain away. When the judge allowed the letters into evidence, there was no objection from the palace's legal team. That silence spoke volumes. One legal expert later commented they knew fighting it would open the vault even further. The timeline, once protected by decades of public relations, was now exposed for the first time. The royal affair wasn't just a tabloid rumor, it was a matter of legal record supported by ink, paper, and the unshakable memory of a sister who had stayed silent for too long. As the final letter was read aloud, a new wave of discomfort swept through the courtroom. No longer was this just about emotion or betrayal, it was about narrative collapse. What followed next wasn't just a response to the affair, it was a full unraveling of the monarchy's most defended storyline. With timelines disproven and silence replaced by documentation, the palace's version of history began to crumble. Now even the past itself was up for re-examination, a palace narrative torn to pieces. For more than 2 decades, the public had been told a neat version of events. Charles and Diana's marriage had failed naturally, and only then did he reconnect with Camilla. It was a rehabilitation story crafted with care and repeated often. But Lady Sarah, his testimony didn't just challenge that, it destroyed it. According to her, Charles and Camilla never truly stopped seeing each other since the early 1980s. The implication was clear, this wasn't a love story resumed, it was an affair sustained. The consequences of this timeline were massive. If Camilla was never truly out of the picture, then she hadn't simply waited in the wings. She had been knowingly involved in a relationship with a married man, all while Diana, a young and emotionally unstable royal bride, was left to navigate royal life alone. One biographer described it as emotional trespassing of the highest order. It reframed Camilla not as a romantic casualty, but as an active participant in the breakdown of a royal marriage. Back at the palace, historians were forced to go into damage control. Multiple official documentaries, biographies, and even televised interviews suddenly looked outdated, even misleading. One royal archivist admitted off the record, "We're having to review decades of approved narratives. It's not just about Charles and Camilla, it's about everything." Public trust in previously accepted timelines collapsed. The once dominant narrative had holes, and those holes were now under a national microscope. To make matters worse, the documents presented in court showed that the palace had likely known about much of this all along. Sarah testified that she believed some senior royal aides had even tried to discourage Diana from documenting her feelings, fearing future exposure. In hindsight, their concern was well-founded, because now the very documents they feared were being read aloud word for word before a judge or jury and a nation. Outside the courtroom, the world responded fast and loud. Hashtags flooded every platform. Images of Diana trended globally, and for the first time in years, questions about Charles and Camilla weren't whispers, they were headlines. The damage wasn't limited to tradition or memory, it was spreading across public opinion. What came next wasn't just media coverage, it was a full public reckoning, public outcry and media eruption. Within hours of Sarah's testimony and the letter readings, social media erupted. Hashtags like #Camilla lied, #Charles knew, and Diana's truth trended on every major platform. Clips of courtroom footage were posted with millions of views. Protesters appeared outside Buckingham Palace, some holding hand-drawn signs reading "Justice for Diana" and "Truth" before titles. The scale of the backlash was unlike anything seen since the 1997 funeral, but this time it wasn't grief, it was fury. Major editorial outlets ran scathing headlines. One newspaper declared the crown's truth has fallen. Another printed an editorial titled "Years of Deception Finally Exposed by the One Who Loved Her Most." Overnight opinion polls showed a massive drop in public trust toward Camilla. His role as queen consort are some. The revelations reopened old wounds, for others it introduced new ones. Even people who have accepted the post-Diana narrative now found themselves rethinking the entire story. The wave of criticism didn't stay online. Palace officials confirmed that dozens of official complaints had been filed with Parliament demanding a formal review of Camilla's public standing. Members of the public called into radio shows, submitted open letters, and reignited debates over the monarchy's place in modern Britain. Public figures and celebrities began to weigh in, some defending the institution, others echoing calls for accountability. Camilla, once a symbol of survival love, was now being painted as the architect of heartbreak. One thing became unmistakably clear: the palace's reputation machine couldn't keep up. All attempts at quiet damage control failed to change the momentum. The people weren't asking for silence. They were demanding answers. A journalist on the courthouse steps summed it up best. "This isn't just about Diana anymore. It's about trust. If they could lie about this for 30 years, what else have they hidden?" The storm wasn't coming, it was here. As crowds gathered in candlelight vigils outside Kensington Palace and camera crews swarmed every palace gate, attention turned to two voices that had remained quiet: William and Harry. For years they had defended the royal line, even in pain, but now confronted with undeniable evidence, their silence was about to break. And when it did, it revealed just how deeply the fracture ran within the family. William and Harry, or a few days after Lady Sarah's testimony, the public waited in tense silence or any reaction from Prince William or Prince Harry. The brothers, often at odds in recent years, had remained quiet. But behind the palace walls, sources said William was furious. He demanded to see the full transcripts of the courtroom proceedings, and was visibly shaken by what he read. One royal aide leaked his private words: "I've defended them for years, and they lied to me too." For William, who had once tried to keep the family together, this was a turning point. According to insiders, William confronted senior palace advisors, directly asking why he had never been shown the original 1986 letters. When told they had been deemed too sensitive, his response was blunt: "You mean inconvenient?" He reportedly cancelled several appearances, choosing instead to stay at an overhaul with his children. It was the clearest sign yet that the future king was at odds with the institution he was born to lead. One aide commented he looked like a man who just lost his compass. Across the Atlantic, Prince Harry responded more quietly, but with just as much weight. From Montecito, he released a brief public statement: "The truth always mattered to our mother. I'm proud of and for honoring that." Unlike William, Harry had long stepped away from the palace machine. But this time his voice wasn't seen as rebellious, it was seen as resonant. It aligned with what many already felt: that Diana had been right all along, and the palace had spent years burying her voice. Despite their physical distance, the brothers shared something unspoken: a fracture in their ties, not just with Camilla, but perhaps with Charles as well. Analysts noted the absence of any messages of support for the king from either son. It was as if the royal line had paused, caught between generations, between myth and memory. For the first time, one commentator noted the crown isn't just divided by politics, it's divided by grief and truth. With public trust fading and both royal sons visibly distanced, the weight of the revelations finally shifted inward. Behind the closed doors of the monarchy, panic set in, strategies were rewritten, staff vanished from public view, and the woman who once waited quietly in the shadows, Camilla, now disappeared from sight entirely. The crown, once immovable, began to tremble, and in that silence, one final voice rose to define it all: the crown's silent collapse. Behind closed doors, the fallout behind the palace walls was immediate and intense. For according to insiders, top aides held emergency meetings strategizing how to contain the disaster. But none of their usual tools, press statements, distraction events, ceremonial appearances, seemed adequate. They reportedly reached out to Lady Sarah requesting a clarification or softening of her testimony. She declined. One court observer summarized it: Simply she said what she came to say, and now she's letting the truth stand. Queen Consort Camilla was said to be in a state of isolation. Sources confirmed she had retreated to Mill House, cancelling all summer engagements. No photos emerged, no interviews were scheduled. One report even claimed she had asked to speak with William privately and was refused. For a woman whose public image had been rebuilt brick by brick, this was a total collapse. It wasn't just reputation damage, said one royal analyst. It was public exile. King Charles, still absent from public view, was described by aides as emotionally gutted. There were whispers of arguments within the palace, of raised voices and broken routine. Staff at Clarence House confirmed that internal planning meetings were postponed indefinitely. One source described it as the collapse of 2 decades of image repair in 2 weeks. The man who had spent years rebuilding his legacy now faced its undoing, not from an outside scandal, but from within his own family. But it was a single quote from Lady Sarah that echoed louder than any royal silence. Speaking softly into a sea of microphones outside the court, she said, "My sister died leaving the world, didn't hear her. Now they finally do." Those words traveled far, printed on posters, shared across screens and whispered in vigils.